So today we are excited to welcome these amazing panelists that will be introduced in a minute by the moderator, Alia Volz, who has been the producer of this event. I can take no credit whatsoever. Please don't forget to follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, etc. We ask for your support of Litquake. Thank you for buying a ticket today, and if you're able, please do go to our website and donate, because we provide 99% of our programming is free to the public, but we also depend on your kindness and donations. I also want to encourage you to go to the bookstore, the book setup out here, when the panel is over, and buy the books of these fabulous authors. And I'm sure they will sign them for you, and maybe you can even ask them additional questions if we run out of time today. I also need to thank our major donors, which include California Humanities, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Grants for the Arts, Minor Anderson Family Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, St. Joseph's Art Foundation, and Yerba Buena Community Benefit District, which this is all part of. They were amazing this year. They let us, through a sponsorship, have access to amazing venues. As you'll look at our schedule at litquake.org, you'll see that we're suspiciously within like a 2-block radius of here. From here to the Bookbinders Museum and on from there. So that is all thanks to them. And without further ado, I want to introduce Alia Volz, who is the fabulous curator of this panel and the author of a fantastically well-received memoir, Home Baked, which is, well, they're all great books, but hers just tickles the fun button like wouldn't believe. So please welcome our panel for today.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you everyone for coming out. This is Blood is Thicker Than Ink. It is a memoir panel, but I wanted to do something a little bit different with the panel today because, as I think some of you may have noticed, there are shifting trends in memoir. And these days, most of the books that you see on the award lists nationally and that are getting a lot of attention are hybridized in some fashion. Either it includes a large amount of research, as all of the books on this panel do, or it includes other elements that are either visual or about a family, about a broader community. They're larger than the self. This isn't what I did for my summer vacation. So I wanted to put together a panel to specifically talk about the intricacies of writing about ideas that are larger than the self and how we can use our familial experiences to access these broader issues. And I think these panelists are going to be fantastic on this, and let me introduce them. To my immediate right is Lilly Dancyger. She's the author of Negative Space, a reported and illustrated memoir selected by Carmen Maria Machado as a winner of the Santa Fe Writers Project Literary Awards. She's also the editor of Burn It Down, a critically acclaimed anthology of essays on women's anger from Seal Press. Lilly is a contributing editor at Catapult and assistant editor at Barrel House Books, and her writing has been published all over the place. All the good spots. She's visiting us from New York City, so please welcome Lilly Dancyger. To my immediate left is journalist and teacher Roberto Lovato. He's the author of Unforgetting, a memoir of revolution and remembrance. It was picked by the New York Times as an editor's choice, and that paper also hailed it as groundbreaking. Lovato is the recipient of a reporting grant from the Pulitzer Center. His essays and reports from around the world have appeared in numerous publications, including Guernica, the Boston Globe, Foreign Policy Magazine, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, and on and on and on. He works out of the Writer's Grotto and was born right here in San Francisco. Please welcome Roberto. Down this way, we have Marie Mutsuki Mockett, who was born to an American father and a Japanese mother. American Harvest, God, Country, and Farming in the Heartland won the 2021 Northern California Book Award for General Nonfiction and is a tribute to the complicated and nuanced history of the United States and its people. Her memoir, Where the Dead Pause and the Japanese Say Goodbye, was a finalist for the 2016 Penn Open Book Award. Marie. And Jane already introduced me, so my book is home-baked. It's won some awards, I've written for some places, and here we are. So I wanted to start by having each person here just say a little bit about what their book is about and how it expands beyond the genre of memoir as we've traditionally known it. You're sitting right here,
Okay.
so you're going to go first.
Hi, thanks Alia, and thanks Litquake. And I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about Negative Space. I call it a hybrid memoir, memoir/art book. In addition to being a story of my life and my parents' lives, specifically my father, it also is a monograph of my father's artwork. He was a sculptor, painter, and printmaker, and images of the work appear throughout the book and kind of guide the storyline. And so I use the art as a way in, kind of my entry point to the story, following the imagery and techniques that he used to kind of get at a truer version of the story of who he was, since he died when I was 12 and I had this very idealized image of him. So this is my attempt as an adult to have a grown-up conversation with him about art and heroin and lots of other things.
And it's absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
I love all of these books. Marie, you say a few words about American Harvest?
Sure. So I grew up here in California. I had a mother who was from Japan, and my father liked to joke that he was a rare breed. He was born in California and then moved to Nebraska when he was 7, so that's where he spent most of his formative years. And his family did have a nice wheat farm in Nebraska, which stayed in our family, and I would visit in the summers with him during wheat harvest. And there was a point, maybe 15, 16, 17 years ago, where I was sitting in the Quonset with my dad and with some of the farmers who actually do the physical work on the land, and I thought, wow, no one in New York City, where I was living at the time, knows anything about any of this. Whole Foods had just opened in New York, and everybody was talking about organic food, and here I was in a Quonset in Nebraska listening to people talk about how they could get rid of the rye and kill the weeds. And I knew that many of the farmers who we interacted with were very devout Christians. I didn't even know the right language to explain what denomination they were, and I knew my friends in New York were atheists, and I thought, what is happening here? And this would be very interesting to write about. And so the result is American Harvest, which in some ways is a road trip as I go along with a group of custom harvesters, people who cut wheat, beginning in Texas, going through the center of the country. And so it's an exploration also of the heartland.
And a very timely book exploring the cultural divide that we're all dealing with today.
Yeah, it hasn't gone away.
No, it seems to have gotten worse. But it was a good try, Marie. And Roberto, would you talk about Unforgetting just a little bit?
Well, firstly, thank you, Alia, for organizing us and bringing at least me together for my first public event in my hometown. I'm really honored. Litquake as well, and my fellow panelists. I grew up just 22 blocks down Mission and then 4 blocks down 25th, down the street from the projects, and we used to be called the Army Street Projects. So my story is at one level of California story. At another level, it's got different levels. It's like, I like to look at it as a story about intersecting underworlds, not just one, but multiple underworlds. And one of them was trying to understand what turned my family's homeland, El Salvador, into the most violent country on earth in 2015. So at the present level of my narrative, it's a journalist's search to understand what creates all these mass graves, death squads, gang killers, government killers, etc. And then at a deeper level, I would say it's about the underworld journey to find the heart in the darkness of El Salvador, of the United States, and of my family, where my father beat my ass and humiliated me to turn me into a rebel, as you'll discover in the course of this. So, yeah, and then it's actually a very optimistic and positive book. I say that without blinking. No, I've been through my own version of Dante's 9 Circles of Hell. And I wrote the book with a mind to share in a Dante-esque, although he's a way fucking better writer than I am, in a Dante-esque way, what blueprints I came up to navigate these extreme times that we are in and that we're going to continue facing as the United States starts looking more and more like El Salvador and the world. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in the mission, and I came and I wrote a book about a mission I have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that one of the things that our books all have in common is that they're not just about one thing, right? And I guess I should introduce mine really quickly as well. So my folks had the first high-volume cannabis edibles business in San Francisco in the 1970s. They were distributing upward of 10,000 brownies a month, and that was where I was born, actually just a few blocks from where you lived, but in a very different world, in like the bohemian artist enclave that was developing there at that time. And then the business evolved into the very dawn of the medical cannabis movement during the HIV/AIDS crisis. But Home Baked is, I think of it as more of a cultural history of San Francisco in the 70s and 80s. It's deeply researched. But I found that the best way to tell that story so that readers could connect with it in a natural, novelistic, pleasurable way was to connect it through family. And it seems, Roberto, in your book, the father-son story, that catharsis that's really ends up being the heart of the book in so many ways, is both a microcosm for the greater struggle and just my take on it, and a way in for readers because it's so relatable. Do you want to read a piece of it?
Sure.
You want to read something about that?
Sure. So, I wasn't expecting that, but
Sorry.
There's a part of the book that I said where I go from being half dead to being more fully alive. That came through rebellion in many ways. Something I really want to incite our young students to right now.
Yes.
In this world, at this moment. One of the things I want to do with the book was show the necessary connection between the epic and the intimate, which I think is abysmally lacking in literature in the United States right now. We're not prepared by literature, a lot of literature, for the world we're facing right now. I don't see it in a lot of what's on TV. I don't see it on the bookshelves. And so I thought, all right, well, I want to contribute something to that. So here's my one small effort to try to connect the epic story of war to the intimate story of my father and me and the conflict that we've had. And I also just want to show that, as Salvadorans and as people generally are, you have all these big stereotypical frames of war, genocide, and all these things, but in between them, there's always humanity, other expressions of humanity. So I'm in a clandestine house. I'm a former urban commando in a guerrilla organization, the Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional. We were fighting a US-backed fascist military dictatorship. And I do mean fascist. They killed 80,000 people, the vast majority of whom were non-combatant innocents. So, and I'm trying to sort out some logistical matters, and so here I am in this house. In the weeks that followed, as my guerrillero work continued, my mind raced with questions, fears, and excitement, even as I tried to keep all the rules and responsibilities of my role straight. First, I had to be clear about the security measures I needed to take. These included altering my routines, coding my messages, not talking to anyone about my business, and doing things in the least expected way, such as taking different routes to destinations. sometimes Chamba, the responsable, the guy in the gorilla cell that was working with me. And I would meet at El Camino Real, one of the swankiest hotel in the country, dressed as businessmen. I always wore a Pierre Cardin suit, a black market suit I commandeered from the once Pop, my father, had left at the Esperanzas, my aunt's house. We'd also meet other urban commando units at restaurants, other five-star hotels, the downtown McDonald's, and other public locations, along with clandestine safe houses. There was a constant and urgent need for equipment, and I was consumed with thinking about how I could secure the needed materiel, much of which was cheaper in the US. After deliberating for some time, I finally landed on the last man, el enemigo, or I, could imagine aiding at a bed in the FMLN's Comandos Urbanos. Pop, my father. My whole life, Pop had eschewed involvement in Salvadoran politics, and for some mysterious reason discouraged me from getting involved, despite he and Mom being very engaged in union members in San Francisco, with Mom even taking me to my first protest at age 10. A big, eye-closing belly laugh burst out of me at the absurdity of recruiting Pop. You know, my dad was a fence. He was operating in the underworld, the contraband in the Mission. The image of him organizing all these crooks, poor, drug-addled vatos from the Folsom Street projects, Hunt's Donuts, and the rest of the Mission to strike out against imperialismo, forming bases estratégicas del frente, strategic bases, made me crack up. The laughter lasted for a few minutes before I began to cry. I'll leave it there.
That's beautiful. Did your father collaborate on your project?
My dad wasn't an urban commando, but he helped secure.
I mean, your book project.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. No, but that story is actually a story of a rapprochement, because he had kind of taken a gun and put it to my chest in the scenes prior to this, and I stopped talking to him, and I rebelled against him, and almost got kind of violent with him, and he got violent with me. So, but yeah, he collaborated in the writing of the book. I let him know what I was going to do. I said, Pop, you know, I'm going to tell your story. You're going to be a central figure in this. You're going to look in all your grandeur, your lyricism, your beauty, your humor, but I got to talk about that other side too. He says, but you got to get it right. I said, yeah, I'll get it right. And I said, I'm going to talk about your family too. And his family was who made him who he was. So his father especially comes out for the person that he was. So yeah.
Yeah. This is something I want to put to the broader table. Did your family members know you were writing about them, and to what extent did they collaborate? How involved were they in your process?
Yeah, I mean, my mother knew that I was writing the book, and I interviewed her extensively. The little snippet I'm going to read is actually about interviewing her. She let me read like the letters that her and my father wrote back and forth to each other when they were newly together, and then when she was pregnant and they were not together, and then when they were back together. And, you know, there's a lot of very intimate, very personal, sometimes angry stuff in there, and she just handed over this stack of letters to me, and I knew in that moment that she was like giving me a very huge gift. She was giving me the ability to tell this story, even though I could see on her face that she was kind of afraid for me to read some of that stuff. And she let me, you know, keep asking her more and more and more deeper and more personal secrets for years and years and years. We would have long conversations, and then I would call her up and, you know, be like, so when was the last time you went to that detox? You know, and she'd be like making her tea, and she'd be like, well, I think it was, you know, and just her cooperation in the process was invaluable. Because my father's not around anymore, so it was either I was going to get it through her or only rely on what I remembered from being like 6 and 7 years old, which would not be all of those details. So yeah, she was.
Do you want to read your excerpt?
Sure. Yeah, I guess this is.
Did you just describe it in a nutshell?
No, you know, that's the broad strokes. But yeah, I'll read this short little bit. This is the beginning of a chapter. I don't think it needs a lot of preamble. I want you to know I never did drugs while I was pregnant with you. My mother told me over the phone. We'd talked about my parents' relationship, the cinematic night they met, the romantic escape to the woods that brought them me, his doubts about fatherhood and how I won him over, the hard time when he left and came back. We'd gone over and over all of it. But eventually, we had to get to the drugs. We'd finally had a long conversation about what she knew about my father's drug use, when it overlapped with hers, periods of time when they were both doing better. And she called me a couple days after that conversation to make sure I had this one point clear. I stopped as soon as I found out, she said, for emphasis, then added, we both did. She insisted that they both stayed clean for the first few years of my life. I believed her, and I didn't believe her. I believed that she stayed clean, and I believed that she believed him when he told her that he was clean too. But I wasn't sure if I really believed that he was. As much as I wanted to think that we had a few wholesome years together, the animal family, it sounded too good to be true. It sounded like a lie an addict would tell his wife. I listened as my mother described again how lovely those first few years were, how in love they were with each other and with me. It was a really happy and sweet time, she said more than once. She painted such a sunny picture, the nostalgia thick in her voice. My mother was living alone in the mountains upstate without much human contact and in poor health. I hesitated to taint her sweet memories of happier times, but I couldn't help it. He might not have told you if he was using then, I finally said, more coldly than I meant to. Silence on the other end, a deep sigh, and then, very quietly, all the reminiscing fondness gone. You're right. I really don't know how much he lied to me. I'll stop there.
So I think one of the really interesting things about this kind of memoir, the memoir looking outward, or the memoir looking outward through family, however, I don't have a good term for it. These are all such awkward labels. But one of the really interesting things about this is that they so often become quests. You know, that the author in the traditional kind of, well, this is a coming of age story, or this was my year abroad, or whatever. The author is already through the process by the time they start the book. They've already lived it. They kind of know what they're going to do already. But with this sort of a book, you go into something that you know is going to be messy. And you don't know how messy it's going to get, and you have to improvise. Sometimes you hit dead ends, and you have to change course, right? When I think you did that a lot in your book.
It just kept opening up and getting deeper and deeper, and I kept, I love those 9 circles of hell. You're talking about your story, but I think the search for finding the story can feel like that sometimes too. You're just going deeper and deeper down into this, like, kind of sometimes scary, ugly place, but you're also finding gems there. Like, that's what you're looking for. That's where you have to go to find the truth, the insight, the whatever, the something new, the understanding of the story, and it hooks you and pulls you in and makes you want to keep going, even though some of the stuff you're finding is hard and hard to look at and hard to sit with and hard to talk to your mother about in great detail, but you get kind of a little bit like hooked on that discovery and turning that story and turning what otherwise would just be painful history into something that you can make something out of, something you can get something positive out of by turning it into art.
I feel like there's just from like a crafty businessy side of things, because I assume we're all writers here, or trying to be, or mostly writers here, at least. From the crafty perspective, I feel like some of that is also back engineered, because there's a way in which, if we're really honest, like, I'm doing this research because I'm writing a book. But you can't put on the page, I'm doing this research because I'm writing a book, because it only really speaks to other writers. So I feel like sometimes the journey has to be backfilled. Anyway, my agent is giving me hell about this with my next book, so I'm thinking about it a lot. Where you're like, okay, no, I am on a greater quest for truth.
Right.
And maybe that's true. And then you get to the end and it's like, oh yeah, I was looking for that deep heart truth all the while, but you're also trying to write a book. Marie, you talked...
We have to talk about your agent later. I'm worried.
Oh, no.
Okay.
We're good. Okay. But I think that there is sort of a convention around, like, being really upfront about my reason for going on this journey is that it's a book. And it's not that it can't be done, and some people have done it, but it usually doesn't.
So,
Work.
this is interesting. As I was sitting here, I was thinking about your question to us, and I generally am asked what the genesis of the book was, and I say this whole thing about organics and evolution, et cetera. But I think one thing I haven't actually been able to have the chance to talk about is I did actually have a personal question, which was, how did my father, who lived in California and was really fairly liberal, work with farmers who probably were lifelong Republicans? How did that work? And I think I think I was asking that question. I've never said that publicly. And he died in 2008. We were very close. He knew I was interested in writing about the farm. I said, nobody's written about, combines and trucks and weed, and but he never saw me really launch, just began to try to put this book together. Other family members did, and most of my American family said, why do you want to write about the farm? That's so boring. The farm is so boring. I mean, the farm was always seen as this boring albatross that was uninteresting because most of my American family live in cities and they have knowledge worker jobs, and even if they did go to Nebraska for the wheat harvest, nobody really saw this as exciting and romantic. My mother, who is from Japan, had more of a feeling of the farm as being a sort of a romantic endeavor. She was able to see the beauty in the land in ways that I think that my American family had kind of lost. So that was probably a driving question. And it's probably one of the reasons why I did think, wait, how does that work? If you're a blue state person, how do you actually work with a red state person? Because everything I read in the media tells me this is not possible.
Do you have your driving question going into it, though? Or do you come up with your driving question as you're going or toward the end?
I think it's good to have your driving question going into it because, I work really hard. I also think I'm sort of a lazy person. So if I don't have a question that really lights a fire under my seat, I won't get going. So absolutely, I think the question is necessary. But the more you dig, it's true, you come up with more questions.
Yeah, it changes.
And that's one of the things that makes writing this kind of nonfiction feel very unstable because you're not actually in control of everything and you don't know what you're going to come across. There were this book generally follows the wheat belt as it ripens. So we went from Texas to Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, through Wyoming to Idaho, very much red states, heartland states. And I was very focused initially on the machinery and on the crew, but I kept running into landmarks, battlefields, and then signs that said something like, Oklahoma's centennial. And I thought, what? Oklahoma's only 100 years old? Why is it only 100 years old? I know California entered the Union circa, 1850? And so then I had to look at the history, and not just on my immediate characters in front of me. So, it became more complicated.
Do you want to read?
Oh, I can read? Sure, I'll read. So I'm going to read something very short. This takes place in Texas, and this is me interacting a little bit with the harvest crew. Some evenings, it seems as though the sky is a lid, pressing down the light to the west and sending it away from us. As dark ink spreads across the eastern horizon, my heart feels crushed, as though it too is being drained of light. Then I feel a direct link between the vastness of space and my tiny human soul, a connection I feel palpably for an hour or two at dusk, when the sky is in opposition with itself. Indigo here and red there. My blood wants to follow the red path of the sun. I want to bleed westward, and my body wants to go there too. Eric almost always wants to use the last bit of sunlight to look at the fields. The light is calling us all to do something. I go with him when I can. The crew continues their evening activities separately without saying where they are going. Bethany doesn't tell me either when I ask. She shrugs, "Oh, we just drive around." But she's a terrible liar, and I see she doesn't want to disclose to me where they have been, but that she is also uncomfortable keeping everything a secret. She seems to be unsure of what all my questions are trying to get at. Justin doesn't seem to care. He's happy to have time to either read a book or sit and watch television in his parents' trailer, or, if invited, to go out with his father. I don't find this so strange. He has already told me he doesn't feel as proficient at farming as the rest of the crew, and that he needs time to read and be alone with his thoughts. I too can be a loner, and so don't find his solitude strange. At sundown, I too often lie in the trailer and read, unless I'm invited to take a look at the land. And then, one evening after dinner, as I'm reading Murray Sandoz, Eric bangs on my trailer door. I open it, and he's wearing shorts, and he says to me, a little wildly, "Want to go shoot pigs?" "Yes," I say immediately. "Meet by the pickup in 10 minutes. I didn't shoot a pig. Just I did go, but I didn't shoot a pig.
Marie, what do you think that your role as the narrator, let me couch this in a little bit more information, that in our books, I don't know if any of us are really the protagonists of our story, which, if you look at what memoir has been in the past, seems a little unusual. But again, this is trending. I mean, this is a way that people are using memoir to access these larger stories. And I'm not sure, I know that I'm not the protagonist of my story. But so what, if you're not the protagonist, or maybe you are, I'm not sure. I don't think so.
I never intended to be the protagonist.
Yeah.
That was actually the first big editorial note I got, was you need to put yourself more in the story. But I don't think of myself as the
me too.
protagonist. Right.
I actually,
You were always
I didn't
there.
make myself the protagonist, but I realized the importance of bringing the reader into my body
Yeah,
and in my mind and my heart
right.
to understand the larger themes I'm trying to get at.
Sure. Right. So what I was going to ask is, if you're not the central focus of the book, then what is your role as narrator?
I mean, I think of myself as the person who's observing, and I think that one of the important things about this kind of writing, just to put it that way, is to own one's subjectivity and to be clear. And I'm not a reporter, and I have tremendous respect for journalists and concern for the work that they're doing out in the world. Their safety is often at risk. What they do is vital. But I'm clear that I'm not a journalist, and that I'm not pretending to be objective and universal. I'm really clear that this is what I'm seeing, and that another person who were to go on the same journey would have a different story. And so I feel like that's really important to own that.
Yeah, I mean, my book changed completely over, it took 11 years to write, and the first draft was a much more straightforward, just artist monograph. It was about my father, and it was about his artwork, and it was the story of his life told through the images in his art. And in that first draft, I referred to his daughter, Lilly. I was trying really hard to be off stage and just be the lens telling this story.
Yeah.
But I got that note every time I got feedback. People were like, what are you doing? Like, come get out here, put yourself in the story. We want to see more of you. What was it like to do all these interviews? What did it feel like to learn these things about your father? How did all of this change you? Blah, 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 all of that. So over time, through rounds and rounds of edits, I kind of got pulled into making it more of a memoir, and became, I guess, one of the protagonists. And it's still very much about my father, but I did situate it much more in my perspective, and realizing that the way that I was going to get readers to care about this unknown artist was going to be to make the emotional stakes of this search for myself feel immediate and urgent, and bring readers into my perspective and why I would spend a decade of my life digging up secrets and conflict and contradictions about the life of this man who most people who read the book hadn't heard of before they read it.
Yeah, I think that really gets at the heart of it, and it's funny that so many of us got that pushback. Home Baked was an oral history initially. I had no interest in writing about myself. I wanted to document a community that people didn't know about. This was an underground movement, and there were stories that were lost, and a lot of the people involved died during the HIV/AIDS crisis, and I felt there was a debt of remembrance. So I wanted to document this community, and I kept trying all these different approaches. It was an oral history, then it was oral history with history, and nothing quite stuck. And I kept getting pushed to no, you have to share yourself. And it was really frustrating for me because I wasn't interested in writing that kind of memoir. In the end, I feel like I cheated a little bit because there's not a lot of memoir in this memoir. It's maybe a fifth about me, or about a fifth based on my own memories. But of course, my voice is all over it as the guide into the world, which is what I ended up seeing my role as, to be a guide into the world, and to also be the one to do the fact checking and to do the research and make sure that the stories were fleshed out, because I'm working with imperfect memories. I guess I'll read something just very short. I don't know if this is the greatest excerpt, but it'll spark the next question. So, so one of the things I think that comes up in family memoir a lot is myth. Family myths. We all have our origin stories that we're told growing up, and at some point, I think part of getting older, part of becoming an adult is unmasking our parents or the people who raise us, if we're not raised by our parents, and dismantling those myths. And my parents were set up on a blind date to exchange psychic readings. I mean, this is super San Francisco 70s. You can laugh all you want, it's fine. And I grew up with this crazy story about how my dad psychically predicted the moment of conception, and there was this whole thing around it. Anyway, this is just a moment from their first meeting of exchanging psychic readings. My mom has read my dad's tarot cards, and now he's giving her an aura reading. And I'll just pop in here towards the end. So he says, "I'm getting a clear picture of Shirley Temple," he said, "a pudgy little girl in tap shoes trying to win the world over with a giggle. Meredith," that's my mom, "had indeed looked like a brunette version of Shirley Temple as a kid. She'd taken tap lessons throughout her childhood, and she still saw herself that way, as a beaming, curly-haired stage hog dancing to make the city smile. He couldn't have known her that well, and yet he did. Doug had seen through the adult mask to the child she still was inside. The reading left her brain buzzing, a vibration around her third eye so intense it was painful, like coming down from an acid trip. She felt spacey and exhausted, but wide open. She expected Doug," that's my father, "to ask her on a real date. Now that they'd plumbed the depths, they could take a step back and have a little fun along with the intensity. But if Doug's finest characteristics were on display in those first interactions, his worst were not far behind. Apropos of nothing, he said, 'You know, Meredith, I was going to ask you on a date, but I'm going to have to reconsider. You're holding on to too much, and it shows. You need to lose weight.' You know your father," my mom says decades later, "Mr. Tactful. It's true. My dad is infamous among our family and friends for making biting, off-the-cuff observations." "How did you respond?" I ask. "I was stunned, hurt. After someone reads your aura, you're very vulnerable. I left quickly." Doug doesn't remember making this comment at all, nor does he remember not making it. This isn't unusual for him. My dad's memory has gaps, some quite large. My family's version of he said, she said arguments would be she said, he doesn't remember. My mom's version prevails, though it bears mentioning that it's not the only possibility. So one of the things that we come up against, I think, in working with any kind of interview writing, are discrepancies, right? People, and if you're writing about family, you end up having to arbitrate 40-year-old arguments between your parents, which is a certain ring of hell. So how do we do that? What did you do when you found discrepancies in the stories people told?
Well, that's where journalism really helped me, is to kind of double check facts and find alternative sources and reconstruct scenes, reconstruct facts based on new evidence, and coming to the best. The best you can do is your best.
Right.
You can't, and even when you do your best, there's a Heisenberg's theories of fiction and nonfiction, which is you don't have the absolute truth when you're talking. You have your truth. You have, and I see my mission is to try to reproduce the heartbeat in another, kind of like mine, especially with the young people. I want, hey man, does your heart beat like this right now in the world that you live in? Maybe there's a revolutionary in you. Because you need to be revolutionary right now, given what your world's facing right now. You're not going to liberal progressive your way out of this. Right? You're not. Simply not. It's a tragedy of our times that, like, I wrote the book in part because I was frustrated as a Central American with Department of Homeland Security statistics showed that 90-something% of all the children being caged and separated from their parents were from Central America. Not a single I did a Columbia Journalism research. I'll get back to, because it's related to the family, but I did research on who are the experts in the stories that you see on Fox, MSNBC, New York Times, everybody. And regardless of who it was, you had how many Central American scholars? 0. How many Central American activists, leaders? 0. How many Central American journalists? 0. Central American anything? 0, except for 2-dimensional images of pain and sound bites of suffering. And so, I face this situation where we are faceless peoples, of voiceless peoples, and how do I attack this? Right? Because I'm an offensive creature by nature. And so I thought, okay, well, let's tell the truth. I asked people in public, I say, hey, how many of you think Donald Trump is a fascist when he cages and separates kids from his mom? Anybody? I asked students that a lot of people do. Then I asked, what about when Barack Obama did that to 5,000 in 2011? Because I've done the homework, I've got the receipts. Not a single hand would go up. The difficulty at the level of the body. So then, when I'm trying to check facts, I'm trying to bring both the visceral and the factual together to create the story. And so, like, my dad would tell me things, and I would double check with my aunts, and then I would take my best shot to try to communicate stuff about my dad or anyone else. So I'm sorry I got a little.
No, that's
relevant.
That's great. I think one of the things that I love about your book is, of course, the layering that we're talking about, but I feel like because you're a serious journalist, your book could be a straightforward book of journalism. It could be, it is deep journalism.
It began that way.
But then the personal level it just opens. It opens the mind and body in such a way, and I think that's what's so powerful about this forum. You're really masterful.
Thank you. I started as a journalist writing it, and then I realized I can't tell my dad's story objectively. And then I have my own back end story, and I said, "Fuck, I better come out." People need to kind of have a sense of what a revolutionary's heart beats like right now. Okay, Trumpism and all that. Okay, so here I am. I came out after 30 years of clandestinity and secrecy about it. And so I want to, and it's a hopeful story. Again, it's the dark cover is just the velvet background against which the rubies and diamonds and rainbows and waterfalls of the story are highlighted.
Excellent. And how did you approach discrepancies, conflicting information, or unanswerable questions? I think we run into all of those.
I was dealing with a lot of gaps in a lot of memories. The central figure of the story has been dead for 20 years. The people who are still around who I can interview were on drugs. There's a lot of vagueness and holes in, trying to get to specifics and details. People could give me great, sense of a time period, but when it came to like trying to get specific events, I had to kind of just rely on what I could get from one person here and another person there and another person here. And it was actually rare that I had multiple perspectives on a single specific event. It was more kind of overall being aware of the biases and agendas of who I was speaking to. So I spent so much time interviewing my mother that, and then I wrote a whole draft where there was a lot of like stuff that she had told me, and then reading it later, I realized that I was kind of writing her version of the story. I was putting in there what was important to her and what she wanted to set the record straight about. And, I had kind of gotten pulled into her perspective because I was relying so heavily on interviews with her. So then I had to take a step back and kind of recalibrate and reorient to the story I was trying to tell, and which details were important to what I was trying to illustrate. And so then I cut out a lot of that stuff and kind of rebalanced it. I kept some of it, but there was a lot of stuff where it was like, this would be 2 chapters worth if my mother was writing this book, but she's not, so I'm going to take it out. And kind of adjusting that way. But it was hard because it was less between 2 poles and more just trying to keep myself focused in a direction and not be pulled too far in one direction or another based on whoever the last person was that I interviewed.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we've often said that our books are in conversation, and I had very much the opposite problem because I interviewed 65 people by the time this was done, and interviewed some of them over and over and over and over again. So I had just mountains of storytelling, right? And it started as an oral history, and so my way of handling the problem of perspective, because clearly, I'm dealing with hippies who were taking a lot of drugs, as well as people who were deeply traumatized by the events of that time. And so I would lean really heavy into someone's perspective. So I'm going to write this scene completely, deeply from this totally fucked up, perspective of this person, even though I know it's got problems, right? But then right next to it, I'm going to go very deeply into another perspective that disagrees with it, so that the perspectives are themselves in conversation and in contradiction. And it was something that really messed with me early in the project. How do you deal with when you can't really figure out which one's right, and with all the fact checking, it's still not there because they're weird little stories people are telling, So how do you deal with that? And I learned to really love contradiction because there's friction in it, and friction is exciting. We all know that, right? So it became, I'd catch someone in a lie and I'd be like, thank you, this is going to be so much fun on the page. And that happened a lot with my dad, I'm going to say. Marie, how did you deal with contradictions between your interviewees or the perspectives that people were sharing you and what you found in your research?
I think if I wasn't satisfied, I just sort of kept digging. And I'm trying to think of how to actually give my answer a better frame than that. I wasn't interviewing lots of family members and then including their stories in the book. It's a little bit different than that. I would say that, so very early on when this was just an idea, I would talk to Eric, who's the gentleman who's standing on the cover of the book, who's a lifelong farmer, and who had cut my family's wheat for a long time, and actually now owns some of the ground that my uncle sold to him. And I said, I've noticed this thing. My friends in New York City all want to eat organic food and shop at Whole Foods, and are by and large not church-going and are atheists. And it seems to me like you and the farmers who work the land are fine with GMOs, and you all go to church, and I wonder why. And he said, you're not really talking about science or religion, and this is in the book. He says, you're not talking about science or religion, you're talking about the divide. And it was the first time that I had realized that was what I was talking about, was this thing called the divide. I thought that I was going to write about differing opinions about organics and GMOs, I didn't realize that I was really looking at a cultural divide. And I have some experience in writing about cultural divides because the last 2 books that I wrote, the books prior to this, were set in Japan. My mother's Japanese. I have some experience in knowing what it is like for one's culture to be misinterpreted, or for everyone to think that everyone who's interested in Japan is super Hello Kitty and that's all there is to it. And of course it's more complicated than that. And no, the flip side is not that everybody meditates like a Zen priest. Like there's a lot more going on than that. So I'm predisposed to understanding that when you're looking at another culture, it's a complicated endeavor. And so I thought, okay, I will write this book about farming, which is actually about the divide, and I'll try to figure out what the divide is. I can read mainstream media and it'll tell me what the divide is in a very sort of shorthand way, but I suppose I had better try to get into the heart of what it is and what it comes down to. And so that's really my answer, is to always ask, wait, what are we really talking about? Wait, what are we really, I'm the annoying person, like I said in that scene. I'm always asking the questions, but wait, what's really happening? And one of the themes, and I'll stop, I'll just say this, one of the things that really emerged for me was really and we know this about people, but understanding that people can be motivated primarily by fear, afraid of everyone, afraid of each other, afraid of anything different. And this sort of an attempt to be more expansive and open and loving, which sounds really hokey, but that there's a significant difference in going out in the world in this way. And that was one of the things that was, I guess, revealed to me in the course of examining this book, but that fear is an incredible motivator, an incredibly divisive agent, and that you see this. One of the things that's interesting about our books is that you see this not just in the divide, but in families. All throughout American Harvest, you meet brothers who are fighting, and they're aligned, and they own a farm, and they work on a farm together, and they're fighting.
I think we should open this up. Does anybody have questions? Yes.
Where do you think the hesitancy to put your own story in your books comes from? And do you think that there is both like an internal hesitancy and also kind of like an external pressure to like take your story out?
It's a great question.
Anyone want to start on it?
Yeah, I think, if those of you that are writers, check out R.D. Laing. Great philosopher, psychologist of the 70s who wrote a book called The Politics of the Family. He shows you in that book the way that your first contact, your first ideological, emotional contact with the state are your parents through their subconscious. So my dad beat my ass into rebellion, so I've always been like ready to fight back. Like, either fight back or fight, flight, or freeze, right? I fought. So the hesitancy is obvious. It's ideological, I think. It's in the family, in the politics of the family, but it's also within the structures of society that don't want us to get at the deeper truths of either, and they're these two etymologically connected entities. Our padres, our fathers, and the patria, the nation. Patriarchy. You all know what I'm talking about, women especially. Men should know more about patriarchy, but we don't. But yeah, the connection between those two is, I think, critical for those of us writing about our families, is to show that, like I just reviewed a book for the New York Times, comes out Wednesday, about, the young writers connecting life in this diasporic community in his family to empire, and he does a great job on the empire stuff, but the intimate part is there not enough scenes, there's not enough dialogue, there's not enough things that bring me as a reader into the heart of the matter, so I can't really get into the contradictions that define us, I
think for me, consciously, I didn't want to put myself in because that just wasn't what I had set out to do. what made me want to write this book and tell this story was wanting to create a record of my father's artwork and wanting to write about him. And, I also have a background as a journalist, so I was more comfortable and more accustomed to telling somebody else's story. And that it felt like kind of stealing the spotlight to put myself in there as well, and felt like I was taking over what I had set out to do. But I think subconsciously, a lot of that probably also came from not wanting to be read as self-pitying or, melodramatic, or, I didn't want this to be a salacious, kind of poor me, my parents were on drugs story, and I didn't want to write, I had a hard time figuring out how to put myself in there without feeling like I was writing a my dead daddy book, which I didn't want to write. And so
Quite a phrase.
So I had to negotiate that balance, but it's easier to not do something than it is to figure out how to do it well.
Well, you just said that, didn't you?
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the same with me. I thought I was going to write novels. I didn't know I was going to do any nonfiction at all. And I remember there was this article that came out in the New York Times years ago in the book review section, putting the moi in memoir, and this sort of sneering, these memoirs, it's all about moi. And I thought, I will never be that person, right? And there's an article that just came out in The Atlantic about this recent scandal. And the writer says something about how, people are trading on victimhood, and, and I thought, oh yeah, I will never be that person. But also at the same time thinking I'm a person of tremendous privilege. I feel like sometimes the message is given to writers that you could write about yourself if you have some axe to grind, or that you're a victim in some way, and if you don't, then what's the model for how to write? And I felt like, well, I'm a person who's really very privileged, and so I want to be careful how I talk about myself in nonfiction. And this is why I say to my students, own your subjectivity. That's the way to tell the story, embedding yourself in the story. And if the piece of the story is that you are, in fact, privileged, or perhaps part of the patriarchy, then we don't have enough of those stories of people who are self-aware and aware of their role within this structure. That can be part of the telling of the story too. So part of it is models, and thinking, if I'm in the story, it's because I've suffered and gone into an institute and tried to slit my wrists. And no, the options for putting the self in the narrative are far greater than that. And it is easier to come up with reasons, no, I can't do that, than to think about how to do it well and honestly and authentically and in an entertaining fashion.
Yeah, some of from my answers is in some ways similar. Except that this really isn't a book about me. It just isn't, and there's no amount of framing that's going to make that the case. So I was reluctant because, look, I'm not born until halfway through the story, and I am a baby for the next quarter. So I only am drawing from memories toward the end, and I really wanted to tell a story about my hometown. And as much, the way that I finally was able to bring myself into it, because people kept pushing me to do it, and it was really in response to that nagging and also realizing that I needed the glue, frankly. But the way that I was finally able to do it was through the connection I felt to the version of San Francisco that made me, that I grew up in. And that was where I was able to see myself in the story, and out of love for my gay aunties and uncles who died, and out of, I had to find this point of connection to the time before my birth and the heart there, the thing that I really cared about and that I did lose. But it's not by any means a poor me memoir. And I also, I wanted to push in the realm of hippie kid stories. I wanted to push against the trope of alternative parenting as abuse, which I've just seen over and over and over and over. There's so many of them out there, and I'm not going to name them, but they're there. And I feel like I know a lot of hippie kids who were not traumatized by their upbringing, and who actually felt that they were given a world of vibrancy and love and opportunity, but they don't write memoirs because there's no drama, no trauma, no trauma, no drama. I don't know how it goes. I mean, so the trauma-driven memoir is so much like baked into our awareness of what a memoir can be. So where I really started to find myself in the world of memoir was in this realm of research, where I can find a point of connection to a thing, but I don't have to center myself in it, because frankly, I'm not that fascinated with my own belly button lint. That's not the story I need to tell. And no shade at all to people who tell those stories, because we need them, but that's not me. So yeah, it's tricky to find a way to navigate what the industry asks of us, and what readers ask of us, because people want that personal connection, and the stories that we feel we want to tell. So it's really an interesting line. Any more questions? Oh,
Is that me?
I don't know, either one of you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. All four of you talked about how interviews were very crucial to your writing. So kind of pivot if someone who is a focal point in your story doesn't want to talk, doesn't want to be interviewed, then I mean, such as how you craft the story, how do you deal with those discrepancies potentially?
Yeah, the super legitimate question. If we're working with interviews, what do we do when somebody who is an essential part of the story declines to be interviewed, or pushes back on being represented on the page? Did you deal with this at all?
Not with the protagonist, no.
With anybody who felt important?
I had some death squad operatives and gang members that didn't want to interview me, but I got to others.
Yeah, that was my workaround too. I had one example where I wanted to interview a particular pot grower. She was not comfortable with it, and I ended up interviewing her former lover, extensively. And I just found another interviewee. And the original person is still in the book, but I gave her a pseudonym, and now she's taken the back seat. I mean, she might have played a more important role and been sort of featured, but she didn't want to, so I changed some defining things and made the other person the more important.
I didn't really deal with that a lot, as most of the people I interviewed were people who were close to my father and were excited to get to talk about him. I did deal with like people being hesitant to tell me anything negative. There's a lot of people who I hadn't seen since I was a little kid, and they didn't want to be the one to tell me the bad stuff. So I had to kind of demonstrate to them that I already knew the bad stuff and that I just wanted more detail. So there was like a lot of putting people at ease in that way by like establishing what you already have, what you already know, letting them know that they're not going to like shatter your perception, and that you're just looking for a little more color. And I think a line I used a lot was, this whole endeavor is pointless if I don't get the whole story, and just letting them know that you're up for it being a difficult conversation.
There's that amazing moment in your book that I really loved and related to, where you're talking to a friend of your dad's, and she brings up a time that you and your dad were staying in an SRO, and it was a super sketchy situation, and she's seeing it as this terrible abusive time that must be this traumatic memory, and then you're like, but we played ball in the hallway. It was one of my most treasured memories. Yeah. I love that. It's a really powerful moment in the book.
Yeah.
Did you run into hesitancy?
I mean, did, and it's interesting because one of there's a sort of a schism that does happen over the course of the journey of the book, and I examined it in multiple ways, and one of the ways in which it's described to me is, well, there's a difference between the people who went to college and the people who didn't go to college. There's a difference between the people who read books and people who don't. And I make this point that there are a number of the crew, the only book that I ever saw them around was the Bible. There are no books. Meanwhile, I'm like, my end of the trailer was like a mess of books. And I became closer to the people on the road who also read books and would go to the bookstore with me. And they were, perhaps unsurprisingly, more verbal and more able to tell me about themselves through stories. And that then made me think, wow, is there a different way in which you think of yourself if you are a reader and you engage daily in this process of narrative, a narrative of self, and versus if you don't? I remember, this is not in the book, but I remember like maybe a number of years ago, I was at it was a reform school for troubled youths, and it was in Japan, but the entire curriculum was set up around Zen Buddhist teaching. So the guy who ran it was a Zen priest, and he ran the training like you would train young monks in a monastery. And at the end of the day, everybody had to tell the story of their day, which was easy for me. And today I got up and I I was happy to meet all of you, and then we went and weeded the garden. It was easy. And some of the young kids struggled with it. And so I ended up examining this as part of the story. People who have difficulty, for whatever reason, conveying their experiences or their selves through story. And I still think about this. Why is it so easy? Why is it so difficult for some? What's going on there? So that then just became another thing I looked at. And for those of us who are sort of accustomed to meeting strangers and very quickly having to put on a social face and encapsulate who we are, that's like the life of somebody who lives in the city, who's daily, constantly, pre-pandemic, interacting with strangers, which is very different if you're on the road with a crew and you're not daily, constantly interacting with strangers.
Yeah, and I think an important point is that if somebody declines to participate, you can state that in the book.
Yes.
Like people like journalists do, right? They decline to comment, and frankly, it makes them look kind of bad. Yeah. But you can also unpack that, as Maria is saying, and Lilly and I have both taught on the idea of memoir being like a whodunit, and there are red herrings, and you hit a dead end. You think you've got a suspect, and then that suspect is exonerated, has an alibi, you hit a dead end. So, but that's an opportunity to take a left turn and try a new angle. So you can find another interviewee. You can, if you don't find your quarry, check a different field. I'm just going to keep mixing metaphors here. What was your question?
So, well, first of all, it's just so cool that all of you started not writing a memoir. All of you. And it's spinning my head because it's like I'm trying to take what you're doing and turn it backwards because I'm writing a memoir, you know what I mean? And so I'm curious, that evolution is so interesting because it's the opposite of most people's journey in this. But how do you deal with deciding who and if to share it with people that are in it, and changing names? I'm just curious because I'm hearing different things in the books I'm reading about memoir, and everybody has such a different opinion about it. I'm confused.
I didn't share it with anybody or change any names. I don't know. I talked with people about, my mother is the person who is most exposed in the book, other than, myself and my father. But she was very aware of and, cooperated in the process of writing it. So she wasn't blindsided by that. And most people who I spoke to were talking about other people. They're talking about their father, or talking about my father more than they are about themselves. There's one person who I offered there's a part where I talk about me as a teenager and my best friend at the time getting into lots of trouble and doing drugs, and it doesn't make either of us look great. And she's now a university professor, so I asked her, "Do you want me to change your name?" Just to, because I felt like if you're revealing something about somebody else, as opposed to just their role in your story, that's a considerate thing to offer. But she said it was fine as long as she just asked that I only use her first name rather than her full name, and I was happy to do that. But as for sharing it, I mean, it became clear that this could have been so many different stories depending on who was driving, and so it was important to me that I maintained that control, and I didn't give anybody else veto power or the opportunity to tell me what it should look like.
Marie?
Well, I mean, everybody knew the quote-unquote main characters in this knew that I was writing a book, so that was not hidden. I think it's important to always check in with yourself and know what your motivations are for writing something. If you're trying to settle a score or shame someone, or I think that those are generally bad reasons. They may, in the short term, be really great ways to get attention, but I think that they are not really very good reasons to do anything. It's
Good for a short story.
It's just fiction. I was gonna bring up subpoenaing group texts, but anyway, yeah, it's not a good. You want to alert people to a crisis, find the revolutionary's heart. These are noble causes. So there's that. And then if you're clear on what your intention is, stick to your guns. That's a terrible expression. Adhere to your, I don't know, what?
Principles.
Thank you. Right? Like, life is short, time is short. You have this thing you want to write. It's important for whatever reason. Be that person. Don't be the person who's like, but I don't know, no. And in my case, I did something sort of unusual this time. I showed the book to Eric, who's on the cover. He asked me to change some names, and so his son Justin and I got on the phone and had a lot of fun changing some names. I don't know that I would ever work that way again, but that's what worked for this project.
I realize I should have been repeating the question back, especially for the recording, but this question is about if we changed names and if we let people look at the work. In my case, because I'm trying to tell this community story and because of the technique I developed for really leaning heavy into each person's perspective and sort of letting them tell their own story and then refuting it if I had to, I took, actually, this suggestion came from Scott James, who's a journalist, and I loved this suggestion, was to do a table reading with the key characters. I didn't do it with everybody, but I did it with the people who are really prominent in the story, which is to say you don't let them keep it, because then they'll show it to their partner, and then their partner will be like, well, you look like an asshole, So you don't let them keep it, but you sit there with them and let them read it through one time. And I wanted people to tell me if there was anything that mischaracterized how they felt in that moment. I didn't let them read what other people said because those parts were in conversation and there was contradiction, right? So nobody read the whole book. Actually, I think my mom did, but nobody really read the whole book beforehand, but people read their own sections. I wanted people to give me their blessing. And interestingly, I was most nervous about my dad because he doesn't always come off well. And I was afraid he would be hurt. And he was hurt at a couple of places. But he thought about it and he realized that it was accurate, even if it was embarrassing. And he asked me to change one thing or two things, and they were the weirdest things. I was like, he wanted it to be really clear that when he gave a psychic reading, his intentions were always good. And I was like, okay, I can put in that line. That's fine. You know, it was easy. It wasn't the stuff that I thought. So I
It's
think
never
that,
the stuff that you think people are going to react to.
yeah. So I think there's like, we have all these fears as we work on these things, you know, and we make assumptions about how our family members are going to respond, and they're not really fair assumptions. So it, you know, it is thorny, and I think each person needs to make a really personal decision about how open they want to be to that feedback, because there are certainly stories of like people being disowned or having lawsuits threatened or families really falling apart. But in my case, and I think in Lily's case, and I mean definitely in many cases, the process can draw a family closer together. And I mean, my book totally healed old rifts that I had no expectation of being healed, because it gave us all the opportunity to finally talk about things. So I don't know, did you encounter that?
To a fellow writer, you're a writer, right? So for the writers out there, I would encourage you to do what we in Salvadoran Spanish call crear un colchón político. Create a political cushion for yourself. You're going to dive in, make the landing softer by anticipating the stuff. So I let people know way ahead of time, like an organizer. Look, this is coming down. We're launching an offensive, a narrative offensive. And, you know, we've got to, you know, I want you on board for this. I need you to back me up on this, bro, sister. So then there's an anticipation that you create an opportunity rather than lead with your fear, which is oftentimes what we're conditioned to do, is to lead with our fear. And your fear will structure things. And let me just say what I did, because we talked about drugs. Mine don't have drugs on the surface, but in the background of my book, drugs are very much there. I did the wisest thing I've ever done as a writer, which was retain a therapist before I started writing.
Yes. Necessary.
And and the gods of good therapy and good decent writing. I guess I can't speak for the writing, but
That's like another book.
gave me a no. It's actually supposed to be a New York Times piece, so the stupid editor killed it. But yeah, no, I was pushing too hard against the Michael Pollan industrial psychedelic complex.
That's okay. I
So
did
like,
too.
the therapist turned out to be part of this clandestine network of therapists. He was a son of a Holocaust survivor and a former hippie who prescribed the most powerful medicine for dealing with some of the matters that I exposed myself to in the course of living this life. Psychedelics. So I microdosed and macrodosed my way through this book that allowed me to go into, you know, as Carl Jung says, you know, the gold is in the dark. Yeah. That's such a truth for what we do here. Yeah. You gotta go deep, hard, and be committed to the truth. Or, you know, we're in the Jewish Museum, so Leonard Cohen, you know, what was it? There's a crack in everything. That's where the light comes in. Don't perfect.
That's why you have to go toward the fear.
Yeah, lean in, dive, go hard, go gently, but go. Otherwise, your writing's going to suffer. It sounds almost cliche, but it's so true.
Yeah, it's true.
I really want to read this essay.
I do too.
Well, it's coming out in Alta magazine.
Oh, there we go.
It's coming out of Alta? Oh, good.
So I feel like we could talk all day, but then people would gradually leave and we'd be left here talking by ourselves. We do, I believe, have to end. But we will step outside. We'll be around to sign books. We can answer some more questions. I want to thank everybody for coming to the Litquake Craft Day. We've got more kind of career-centered panels going on tomorrow. Of course, the whole rest of the festival is you can find online the schedule events. There's so many great events. Please donate to Litquake, buy books, support your authors, support your bookstores, and keep on writing. Have a beautiful day.